In Miami, it looks like a burglary gone wrong. At least that's what the murderer hoped. But to detectives, the clues reveal the truth. A man dies in the flames of his burning truck. But the real crime scene is miles away. Can forensics prove that connection? Investigators grapple with a double homicide. The sole eyewitness reports the victims were killed by a ninja assassin. Some kill out of hatred. Some do it for love. But for others, murder is all in a day's work. Their services are available to anyone willing to pay the price for their deadly dealings. In the early morning hours of March 7th, 1986, police received a call from the home of Stan and Joyce Cohen in Coconut Grove, Florida. At 5:25 a.m., Joyce had frantically dialed 911, reporting that an intruder had entered their home. Her husband was shot in his sleep. Stan Cohen, a 52-year-old owner of a construction company, had been shot 4 times in the head. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Homicide detectives were called in. Leading the investigation was John Spear.
When I arrived at the scene, I met Joyce Cohen. There were only 2 people in the house, according to Joyce Cohen, when this homicide occurred. Now, my teachings and my beliefs are when you have 2 people in a house or a room or anywhere, and one of them ends up dead, you should suspect the other person until your suspicions are relieved.
This right here?
But suspicions can only take an investigator so far, and they ultimately mean nothing in a court of law. The truth is told through the evidence. Meantime, the medical examiner conducted an autopsy on Stan Cohen. He ruled gunshot as the official cause of death. He was told the victim was killed between 5:15 and 5:20 that morning. He had no reason to question it.
Could have a seat right here, please?
While the forensics team swarmed the Cohen's house,
Get you to put your hands on the table, ma'am.
Joyce went to the police station.
Ma'am, this is
She agreed to a routine swab test for gunpowder residue.
What I'm going to do is swab your hands, and if there's any shots or traces of gunshot residue.
While awaiting the results, she gave her statement. According to Joyce, she and Stan were awakened by a noise downstairs.
I think I heard something.
What'd you hear?
Stan picked up his gun, and the two went to investigate. A quick search of the house showed nothing amiss. Relieved, the couple returned to bed. But Joyce claimed she couldn't sleep, so she went back downstairs. At approximately 5 a.m., a friend called from Colorado. As they were talking, she heard a noise in the kitchen. She noticed the glass in the kitchen door was broken. She said she hung up from her friend. Then she saw a figure running downstairs and out the door. She ran upstairs to check on Stan. She found him bleeding in bed. She couldn't rouse him.
Oh my God, what happened?
She dialed 911.
Honey, are you okay? Are you okay?
When I advised her that there were some inconsistencies in this particular story that she told me about the homicide, It irritated her.
She demanded that the forensics team immediately leave her house and not return without a search warrant. She said she didn't want any of her husband's things taken or touched. Detective Spear couldn't understand her hostile reaction.
Now, if a loved one of mine or anybody else that I would know was killed, I think they would cooperate 100% with the police. To me, she was not cooperating.
To Spear, it seemed she knew more than she was letting on.
The only thing we can do is maybe...
I got some lady kept her in there.
Until the warrant was issued, investigators were locked out of Cohen's house. 4 hours later, the paperwork came through. Joyce Cohen was presented with the warrant, and the team swung back into action. They went inside to dust for fingerprints. Joyce was called back to the police station to continue her interrogation. By now, the residue tests on her hands had come back from the lab. They were positive, showing she'd had contact with gunpowder. She calmly provided detectives with an explanation.
When she discovered her husband's body in the bed, she grabbed him and a pillow. And possibly that's what caused her to have the gunshot powder residue on her hands.
Investigators made a note of her response and pressed on. They noticed that her story changed slightly from her first interview.
Hey, thanks for calling.
Now, instead of saying that her friend called from Colorado at 5 a.m., she said it was closer to 3 a.m. That left a gap of 2 hours between the time of the break-in and her call to 911. Slips like that can mean nothing, or everything. It was too early to tell. The evidence was still being gathered. Outside the house, police discovered a gun in the garden. It was taken to the Miami Police Crime Scene Investigations Unit, where it was examined by Technical Supervisor Sylvia Romans. After photographing the weapon, she tried to raise fingerprints.
Upon fuming the gun, I found some evidence of fingerprints. They weren't of much value, but the most significant thing that I found was that it appeared the gun had been wiped down.
Ballistics showed that it was the weapon that killed Stan Cohen. Because it was one of the victim's own guns, it seemed like a dead end. Except it bore one tiny clue. Romans found a shred of paper facial tissue caught between the frame and the grip. It suggested the gun had been wiped clean with a tissue. It also suggested another clue to look for. Samples of facial tissue were collected from around the house. In a trash can in the back bathroom down the hall from the murder scene, detectives found a soiled tissue with black residue on it. It was sent to the lab.
The lab was not able to determine whether, in fact, the tissue that was found on the gun was an exact match to the tissue that I had submitted to the lab. However, the tissue did have gunshot residue, and it also had the mucuses of Joyce Cohen.
Blood in the nasal mucus matched Joyce Cohen's blood type. It strongly suggested that Joyce had shot her husband, then wiped down the gun with this tissue. But facial tissue makes flimsy evidence. To win his case, Spear needed something more substantial. What he got was a confession from someone who wasn't even a suspect. In the case against Joyce Cohen, Miami police were hampered by lack of solid evidence. But 1 month after Stan Cohen was murdered, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A career burglar named Frank Maglione was arrested for a separate crime. He knew about the Cohen murder and wanted to strike a deal.
We learned that he and 2 other companions assisted in this homicide and were paid to do this homicide by Stanley Cohen's wife, Joyce Cohen.
Maglione knew things that only someone involved could have known. So it was clear he was telling the truth. But even this startling confession didn't assure Joyce Cohen's conviction. On the stand, it would come down to the words of a grieving widow versus the testimony of a career criminal. Feeling he didn't have enough evidence to get a conviction, Spear spent 2 years chasing the other men Maglione implicated. But they wouldn't crack. He had to rely solely on Maglione and the forensic evidence to prove Joyce Cohen's involvement. According to Maglione, Joyce met him and the others at a restaurant to plan the hit. Joyce had it all mapped out. It was supposed to look like a burglary gone bad. They were to arrive at the house between 2 and 3 a.m. and use Stan's own gun to kill him. Maglione's story had one nagging inconsistency: the time of the hit.
So they can make friends.
Phone records showed that Joyce called 911 after 5 a.m., not 3 a.m. They also showed that her friends called from Colorado shortly before the 911 call, around 5. It didn't make sense for Joyce to wait 2 hours to call police, and yet 3 a.m. is also the time Joyce gave in her second statement. What seemed like a possible slip of the tongue suddenly became pivotal to the case.
Are you going to wait there for us?
Police suspected that Joyce may have waited in order to create her alibi. They followed that lead. They learned that a guest at a neighbor's house was awakened on the night of the murder by what sounded like gunshots. He recalled looking at the clock. It was around 3 a.m. The information supported Spear's theory. But even this report was nothing more than circumstantial. To truly determine the time of death, he needed the testimony of the victim, Stanley Cohen. Originally, the medical examiner had no reason to doubt the time of death according to Joyce Cohen, and listed it at 5:30. Now, determining the time of death was more tricky. The body had long since been buried. All that remained were photos taken upon its arrival at the medical examiner's office. Hours after death, blood settles in the lowest portions of the body in a process called lividity. The pooling blood creates telltale red marks. From the extent of the lividity marks, a medical examiner can estimate the time of death.
7 by 5 centimeters.
Joyce Cohen's lawyers hired an expert witness who requested copies of the autopsy photos.
Over the right side.
He determined there was no lividity when the pictures were taken, meaning the victim was killed shortly after 5 a.m., as Joyce originally asserted. But because the defense was viewing second-generation reprints of the photos, the subtleties of the images were lost. Testifying for the prosecution, the medical examiner went back to his original photographs. The lividity was apparent, meaning the victim was killed around 3 a.m. Joyce had waited 2 hours to call the police, proving she was part of the conspiracy to kill her husband. Maglione's testimony put into question the time of death. The autopsy photos confirmed his story. The forensics work on the scrap of facial tissue further proved Joyce Cohen's connection to her husband's murder. At the prearranged time, Maglione and his team arrived at Cohen's house. She was awake and let them in. They already knew where to find Stanley's gun. They went to the bedroom, shot him 4 times, then ran out. On the way, they dropped the gun. Joyce picked it up, wiped it down with the tissue, and threw it out the window into the garden. She then perhaps blew her nose on the tissue and disposed of it in the far bathroom. Although it was never proven, she may have arranged with her friends in Colorado to call her, thereby establishing her alibi. Unfortunately, the friends called too late, or there was some confusion over the time zones, Colorado being 2 hours earlier than Florida. Her own alibi betrayed her. Joyce Cohen received 40 years for murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Frank Maglione received 10 years. The co-conspirators were also rounded up and received sentences of no less than 39 years. Murderers are optimists, always believing they can get away with it. But reality has a way of catching up with them, one fact at a time. On a sleepy Saturday morning in August 1988, a driver on a rural road outside of Oklahoma City was startled by the sight of a burning truck. He got out to take a better look. Curiosity turned to horror when he saw the body of a man lying on the driver's side of the cab, his leg dangling out of the open door. After the fire department quenched the blaze, Oklahoma City police investigated the scene.
Wow, look at this, Joyce.
Yes.
The vehicle was annihilated. A man was dead.
Hey, Mark, can you come over and take some pictures of that?
Definitely a lot of evidence. But the guy from the gas tankers.
While police traced the vehicle to determine who the victim was, the sheriff's department received a call from a woman whose husband hadn't returned from work. Marilyn Plants, an Oklahoma City housewife, told the sheriff that her husband Jim, a newspaper press room supervisor, should have been home 2 hours ago. She was distraught. It wasn't like him to be late. Marilyn said that she'd last seen her husband at dinner the night before. It was just like any other evening. After the meal, he went off to work.
I made some chocolate chip cookies for dessert.
Oh, cool. Can I take some to work?
He mentioned nothing about having to stay late. The make and model of Jim Plantz's truck matched the burned vehicle. Later, dental records proved the victim was indeed Jim Plantz. City officials were left with the sorry task of telling Marilyn Plantz that her husband had died in a horrible accident. But investigators weren't entirely convinced it was an accident. A spot of blood found on the road behind the truck raised questions. From the condition of the truck itself, investigators quickly ruled out mechanical failure or a cigarette mishap as the source of the fire. Lieutenant Ralph Gibson led the investigation.
We found that there was a rag, cotton rag, partially burned in the gas tank, indicated like someone tried to set it on fire to blow it up. The actual fire was so hot that gasoline or something in that order was used, that it burned so hot that the glass actually melted in the vehicle.
The ferocity of the blaze gave investigators reason to suspect that the truck was intentionally torched. The autopsy fueled those suspicions. It revealed that Plants suffered head trauma and broken forearms, but his truck showed no signs of collision, suggesting he was beaten, then placed into the vehicle. The gases in his lungs showed he was still alive when the truck was set ablaze. The case officially became a homicide. To find the killer, Gibson first needed to find the motive. Gibson learned from Plantz's employer that the victim had recently increased his company life insurance from $50,000 to $290,000. He had a separate policy for an additional $20,000. Dead, Jim Plantz was worth more than $300,000.
The increase in insurance definitely got my attention as a motive for a homicide.
Unsure of?
Well, sure. Go
The beneficiary of the money was Jim's wife, Marilyn Plantz.
over the back of the couch.
It didn't seem likely that the young mother would be strong enough to beat her husband to the threshold of death and then drag him into his truck. Investigators asked her the routine questions about the state of her marriage, her financial situation, any enemies her husband may have had. Her answers were equally routine. No motives or enemies came out of the conversation. It began to look as though Plantz may have been the victim of a random act of violence. Gibson persisted in the investigation.
As I routinely do when I work homicides, I do a background investigation on the victim and associates and their vehicles. Upon checking Marilyn Plantz's vehicle, I determined that it was stopped about a week prior.
Driving the car was a man named Clifford Bryson. Marilyn Plantz was the passenger. Police wanted to know if they witnessed the theft of a pickup truck that just occurred. Bryson said he thought he recognized the driver. It was a man named Roderick Ferris. With nothing else to go on, investigators followed this tenuous lead and decided to talk to Ferris. They didn't have far to go. Ferris was in the city jail, charged with stealing the truck. Perhaps he'd be willing to swap information for a more lenient sentence.
I asked him, did he know Marilyn Plantz? And he said, yes, he did know Marilyn. He said, what's strange, she offered him $10,000 to kill her husband. He claimed that, and since he was in the city jail, he had no knowledge that he had been murdered.
Thanks to Ferris, the cast of characters in this deadly drama began to be revealed. Ferris said Marilyn made the same offer to Clifford Bryson. He said that Bryson and Marilyn were having an affair. Bryson was called in for questioning, and the finger-pointing continued. At first, Bryson claimed to have limited knowledge about the incident. But as the interrogation continued, he admitted that he knew about it beforehand. He wasn't involved, he said. The man they were after was named Clinton McKimble. Bryson was arrested as an accomplice. In short order, Clinton McKimble was also brought in, questioned, and arrested.
He admitted that both he and Bryson were the participants, that they were solicited by Marilyn Plantz to kill Marilyn's husband, Jim. They waited inside the house, beat him with baseball bats unconscious, took him to 50th and Sooner, and set him afire.
When the smoke cleared, Gilbert had confessions from the murderers, but he had only their word that Marilyn was the mastermind. Unless he could find some physical evidence to back that up, she would go free. Police had every reason to suspect that Marilyn Plantz planned her husband's murder. Problem was, they couldn't prove it. Confronted by police, she denied everything. A search warrant was served on her house, the alleged scene of the crime. Investigators pulled back what looked like a new area rug.
Check the underside of the rug.
It concealed spots and bleach stains on the wall-to-wall carpet below.
Get in.
They cut the carpet, revealing what resembled blood stains soaked into the padding. It was collected for testing in the lab. Tiny telltale spatters on the draperies and wall also were collected. In the child's bedroom closet, 2 stained baseball bats were found. Bryson told police that after they burned the truck, they returned to Marilyn's house. Because their clothes were covered with blood, Marilyn gave them the victim's clothes to wear. They bundled their own clothes in a bag and disposed of them in a creek a half-mile from the Plantz's home. To corroborate Bryson and McKimball's story, the creek was searched for evidence.
The odds of finding this evidence were actually against us because we had several days of rain and the creek has swelled.
The diligent team managed to find the clothing. The evidence from the creek and the Plantz's home was bagged, tagged, and sent to the DNA serology laboratory of the Oklahoma City Police.
Carpet in. We're going to get the washcloth and jeans.
There, each piece was scrutinized to see if it contained blood, and if that blood matched that of Jim Plantz. Only then would Bryson and McKimball's account be proved. The outcome of the case rested on the shoulders of forensic chemist supervisor Joyce Gilchrist.
Oh, great, thanks.
But some of the evidence didn't look hopeful.
I was very surprised that when the evidence was submitted to our laboratory from the clothing that was taken from a creek, the request was made by Detective Gibson for me to see if I could find any blood stains on the clothing.
Cold running water is the best way to remove blood stains. The clothing had been in the current for over a week. Gilchrist was fighting the odds. She knew the chances of detecting blood, let alone typing it, would be slim. To find traces of blood, Gilchrist used luminol, which makes blood stains glow in the dark. The luminol solution must be mixed just before use and applied right away. It was sprayed onto the jeans. Then the lights were extinguished. The faint glow provided a glimmer of hope. The blood hadn't washed away. Now she had to see if its proteins were intact enough to identify whose it was. Before the advent of DNA testing, investigators relied on blood typing, which is less precise. To determine the blood type on the evidence, Gilchrist used a technique called absorption illusion. Bloodied threads from the jeans were glued into small wells using ordinary nail polish. Then human anti-serum was added. It was incubated overnight under controlled temperature. Next day, the blood was tested for its type, A, B, or O. Surprisingly, the tests on the blood were a success. Despite its time underwater, the blood was in good enough condition to reveal that it was type A, the same as Jim Plantz's. The results were encouraging, but not conclusive, because type A blood is shared by millions of people. To be certain the blood was the victim's, it was subjected to a more complex test for enzymes specific to his blood. The chances of anyone else having the same set of enzymes are slim. Proteins are added to the samples. Drawn across by an electric current, the samples react, creating light and dark bands. If the bands on the sample matched the bands created by the victim's blood, Gilchrist could be certain the unknown sample is Plantz's blood. She had a match. The blood on the jeans was undeniably the victim's. This part of the killer's story checked out.
They did such a good job of wrapping the garments that they protected that blood for us, so that when it went into the water, the blood was protected from being washed away by the water itself. And when the items were found by our investigators and then brought back to the laboratory to be analyzed, I could make an association back to the victim very easily.
According to Bryson and McKimble, the murder occurred at Plantz's house. The blood evidence collected there suggested this was so. It was Gilchrist's job to prove it beyond a doubt. The blood collected from the carpet, walls, and drapery were not as conspicuous as the blood on the clothing, but the tiny droplets were in much better shape. The same tests were performed on these samples. The results came quickly. The blood belonged to Jim Plantz. The murder had obviously occurred in the Plantz's home, just as Bryson and McKimble had said. Now, Gibson had to prove that Marilyn Plantz knew about it. She was called in for an interview.
She denied just about everything. That at first she didn't even know any of the other two participants, being Bryson and McKimble. Then during the interview, again, she changed the story to fit the facts as she learned that we knew more than what she thought.
Marilyn insisted that she was asleep until about 8 a.m. She never heard her husband come home, heard no commotion. If Bryson and McKimble killed the victim in her home, it was totally without her knowledge. Gibson had to prove that the new area rug wasn't the only thing lying in the Plantz's home. He knew that Marilyn was trying to cover up her involvement in her husband's murder. The new rug could be his most damning piece of evidence.
I was trying to find a way to link her to the purchase of that rug because it was a new rug. So I checked with the manufacturer of the rugs, and they told me one of the primary carrier was Walmart. And there was a Walmart just a few blocks from Marilyn's house. So I got a subpoena for the bank records of Marilyn Plantz. And when I went through the bank records, I found a check to Walmart on the day of the killing.
I've got the receipts right here.
Gibson visited the store manager, who retrieved the original receipt from Marilyn's purchase. The itemized document showed that on the date of the murder, she made two purchases: a soft drink and an area rug. The transaction occurred at 9:11 a.m.
This is a girl that just reported her husband missing, and she goes and buys a rug at 11 o'clock, over 11 minutes after her store opens. She didn't shop a whole lot either.
The purchase of the rug was proof that Marilyn Plantz had full, willful knowledge of the murder of her husband. According to what police could discern, when Jim Plantz came home from work that morning, Marilyn's lover, Clifton Bryson, and his friend, Clinton McKimble, were already there,
Get some scrambled eggs, okay?
waiting to bludgeon him with baseball bats. While Marilyn cleaned up the house, the two men put the victim's body into his truck. Drove it to a remote road, doused it with gasoline, and set it afire. The victim should have been dead, but he wasn't. He made one futile attempt to flee the flames. Then he was consumed. The truck should have exploded, destroying the evidence, but it didn't.
The three conspired to kill Mr. Plantz for the insurance money. McKimble did it for $45,000 that he was promised his share. The other two were going to take the rest of the money, move to Texas, and live off this particular insurance proceeds.
Instead, Marilyn Plantz and Clifton Bryson were sentenced to death. Clinton McKimble received life in prison. Many so-called perfect crimes are spoiled by the confessions of a participant. A single word from a reliable source can send a solid alibi crashing to the ground. It was the night of September 25th, 1985. Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, had drawn to a close. Vera and Gerald Woodman marked its passing at a dinner party at the home of Vera's sister in Bel Air, California.
Thank you.
After bidding goodnight to their hosts, the couple climbed into their car for the 15-minute drive to their condo in Brentwood. They didn't know that their movements were being watched, that they were heading into a trap. Gerald Woodman was a self-made man, earning his fortune with his plastics business. He and Vera were married 45 years and raised 3 sons and 2 daughters. Though he was 67 years old and had undergone bypass surgery, he was still energetic and refused to retire.
You make a right. Okay. Take a left.
On his way toward wealth, Woodman had evidently made some enemies. The Woodmans pulled into their parking spot in the condo garage at about 10:30 p.m. But they never made it out of their car. The ringing gunshots drew the attention of one of the residents, who raced to see what the commotion was. He caught only a glimpse of a single figure shrouded in black as it vanished into the darkness. He called the police to describe what he'd seen. LA detectives Richard Crotzley and Jack Holder were assigned to the case. Holder knew it was going to be a tough one.
I received a call at home from my lieutenant, Ed Henderson. He advised me that we had a double homicide in the West Los Angeles part of LA, and that the suspect was described as a ninja warrior.
The media pounced on the image of a ninja assassin on the prowl in West LA. The description was bolstered by the discovery of bare footprints at the murder scene. But the murders relied more on firepower than martial arts. Investigators eventually surmised that the ninja garb was just a disguise, and the footprints were made by the witness. The media still clung to the ninja image. Gerald had been shot once at close range. Vera had been shot 2 times. Police found no shell casings, so they knew the weapon was a revolver. Ballistics determined it was a .357 Magnum, a uniquely powerful weapon. The motive for the crime wasn't immediately clear. Gerald still had his wallet. Vera still wore her jewels. Nothing in the car seemed to have been touched or taken. To Richard Crotzley, the crime smacked of a professional hit.
So, since no property was missing from either Vera or Gerald at that time, and it appeared that the robbery was not a motive, things crept into our mind that all of a sudden this could possibly be a murder for hire.
Because hired killers have no connection to the victim, they're harder to catch. And because the person who orders the killing can do it from a distance and has time to establish an alibi, he's harder to convict. Investigators needed to work the case from 2 angles. First, they would have to process all the evidence at the scene to catch the gunman. Then they'd have to compile a list of the Woodman's enemies to find out who ordered the hit. They determined that the killers entered the garage by cutting a chain that secured a gate. Apparently, 2 pieces of chain link ended up in a nearby planter, where they were recovered. It wasn't a lot to go on, but detectives knew that if they did their job right, this tiny clue could be the first link in a chain of evidence that would lead to the killer. In West LA, 2 chain fragments were the only clues in the Woodman double homicide. They bore no fingerprints. They were brought to the LAPD's Scientific Investigations Division for further analysis. A low-power comparison microscope revealed that the scratches and imperfections on both pieces were continuous, showing they were 2 halves of the same link.
The 2 pieces of chain link recovered from
The shape of the cut helped supervising criminalist Bill Llewellyn surmise the kind of tool used to make the cut.
I was further able to examine the pieces of chain link and determine that a tool that might have been used to cut the chain link would have been a bolt cutter.
While the physical evidence was being gathered, police looked for a motive for the killings. Neighbors had told police that Gerald Woodman was involved with racehorses and gambling. He might have gotten in over his head. A look into his gambling debts turned up nothing. In fact, he'd done well and had no outstanding debts. But another motive may have stood closer to home. Vera Woodman's daughter and sister had an interesting story to tell.
They immediately proceeded to tell us about the dispute that had arisen between Gerald and his 2 older sons, Neil and Stuart Woodman, involving the takeover of the family business by the sons. They were very intense and adamant that Neil and Stuart had killed their parents.
Gerald Woodman had built Manchester Products, his plastics company, from scratch. When he had a heart attack, he entrusted it to his sons, Neil and Stuart. At the helm, the sons wrested the majority stock away from their father, shutting him out. Gerald spent most of his savings trying to win the company back. The ensuing hatred split the family. Neil and Stuart were no longer welcome at family functions. Gerald and Vera were not allowed to see their grandchildren. Everyone police spoke to gave the same story about the animosity that centered around the Woodman boys. Finally, it was time to speak to them directly. The brothers agreed to meet investigators at their attorney's office.
Now, any time that you want to interview a family member regarding their parents' death, why in the world are you going to get an attorney? Right then and then, I think Jack and I decided these guys are involved. Now, how are we going to prove it?
While Crutzley and Holder pondered where to gather their next clue, it walked in the door. 2 former LA cops who moonlighted as security guards paid police a visit. They said that a man named Steve Hummock, who was employed by Neil Woodman, had recently hired them to keep Gerald and Vera Woodman away from their grandson's bar mitzvah. The former police officers told investigators that Hummock had given them some harsh instructions.
We had been told that Mr. Hummock had made the statement during a breakfast meeting prior to the bar mitzvah that Neil had told Steve, "What are you going to do if he comes around?" And Steve had replied that he would waste him.
A background check on Steve Hummock revealed that he was a former LA cop who had been fired after less than 1 year on the force. He was now living in Las Vegas and was under FBI surveillance for drug trafficking. He and a business associate had flown from Las Vegas to LA the day before the killings and had returned to Vegas the day after. Placing Hummock in Los Angeles on the night of the murders was a start. But LA's a big city, and Hummock could have gone anywhere. Police learned that his brother, Robert Hummock, lived less than 4 miles from the crime scene.
We also discovered that Robert Hummock was involved in a traffic accident the night of the murders within a half a block of the murders.
This seemed like more than a coincidence. Hummock's accident took place in the alley behind the Woodman's condo. Robert Hummock's record also showed that 3 months before the murders, he had been questioned by police for apparently loitering around Vera and Gerald's building. It was the date of the Woodman's anniversary, one of the few times Vera Woodman left the condo.
On our friend Jesse.
Investigators suspected that the Woodman boys had hired the Hummocks to kill their parents. It would take more than the evidence at hand to prove it. Federal agents had already put traces on Steve Hummock's phone in Las Vegas. Many of the calls were to his brother, to the Woodman's sons' homes and office, and to payphones near their houses. Phone records for all of the suspects were analyzed. They showed a flurry of activity just before the murders.
And looking at those records and our records, we started putting everything together that there was all kinds of conversations linking these suspects to each other.
It was enough to obtain a search warrant for Steve Hummock's apartment. There they found copious diaries detailing his activities. But he gave everyone a nickname, wrote everything in code. Investigators were able to crack it. One of the things police learned from the diaries was that Stuart Woodman had hired Robert Hummock to burglarize his own house so he could collect on the insurance. He also stole and torched a company car for the same reason. If Hummock was involved with the murder for hire, he wasn't so rash as to write about it. But his books did suggest that his brother Robert was often his partner in crime. Investigators next served a warrant on Robert Hummock's apartment, 4 miles from the murder scene. There, they found a new pair of bolt cutters. Assuming that Robert Hummock wouldn't have traveled far to purchase the tool, detectives spoke to the clerk at the hardware store just down the street from his apartment. The clerk confirmed that the cutter could make short work of chain link, and she recognized Hummock from pictures detectives showed her. She had sold him the cutter. The bolt cutter was sent to the forensics lab to see if it was the tool that sheared the link outside the victim's parking garage. Bill Llewellyn focused his microscope on the minute scrapings, or stria, on the blades.
Essentially, they are the bolt cutter's fingerprint. They are present on that bolt cutter, and no other bolt cutter will have the same set of stria pattern.
What's really unusual about the bolt cutters in this case is they were virtually brand new, and you could actually see marks on the jaws of the bolt cutters where they had been used to cut the chain link, which made my job much easier in that I had a very small area in which to focus my examination for the stria patterns.
After examining the blade, Llewellyn used it to cut a small piece of lead. The soft metal became impressed with the blade's stria without damaging the tool's cutting surface. The stria on the lead was then compared with the stria on the chain link. From the comparison of the stria, Llewellyn could determine indisputably that this bolt cutter cut this link. The broken chain was the missing link that Holder needed. It bound Robert Hummock to the scene of the crime, while the phone records and diary entries connected him to the Woodman brothers. But without witnesses or motive, the case was far from being locked up. Investigators struggled for 6 months to build their case against the Hummocks and the Woodman brothers. And then came a break. One of the Hummock's partners was arrested for unrelated charges. To reduce his sentence, he confessed to being a lookout on the night the victims were killed. He said that the Woodman brothers ordered the hit.
Sorry.
That left only the motive. On the surface, it seemed like the Woodman sons had already gotten what they wanted. They'd stolen their father's successful company out from under him. Why, except for sheer hatred, would they want to kill their parents? The fact was, under Neal and Stewart's control, the company started to falter badly. They were doctoring the books. According to Detective Holder, they were desperate.
They had milked the company for every cent they could. They were being audited by the banks, and they were about to go under, and they couldn't stand the thought of their father seeing them lose and go bankrupt.
Fired by hatred, motivated by greed, and doomed by incompetence, Neal and Stewart Woodman took their father's company and destroyed it. Vera Woodman had a $500,000 life insurance policy payable to the company. It wasn't enough to get Manchester Products out of debt, but it was the only hope the Woodman boys held. Holder and Crotsley, with the help of criminalist Bill Llewellyn, had their evidence in place and were ready to arrest and prosecute. Armed with phone records, journal entries, a henchman's confession, and the cut chain link, they were able to tell their story of murder for hire.
Was the first time that LAPD had put on a case where they used tool mark impressions as evidence.
The evidence was enough to convince the jury. For conspiracy to murder Vera and Gerald Woodman, Neal and Stewart Woodman received life in prison. Robert Hummock, life without parole, and Steve Hummock, death. There may be honor among thieves, but the same cannot be said of murderers. When the heat's turned up, confidences are broken, partners betrayed. And an assassin who's only in it for the money is willing to pay any price to save his own life. Once he agrees to bargain, it's up to forensics to determine the truth of his tale.